The dust of Redemption Gulch, Arizona territory, tasted of grit and failed prayers. My Lin felt it coat her tongue and settle in the folds of the silk wrapping on the packages she carried. One was a box of ceremonial teas, the other a heavier parcel whose contents were known only to her. Both were gifts for the man she had been sent to marry. On her back, a heavy camphor wood chest, secured with leather straps that cut into her shoulders, contained everything she owned in the world. Her father's final words to her, slurred with whiskey and self-pity, echoed with the rhythmic slap of her worn slippers against the baked earth. He is a killer, but he is owed a debt. You are plain and stupid, but you can keep a house. It is more than you deserve. She had walked the last 5 miles from where the freight wagon driver, his face a mask of pity and suspicion, had dropped her at the territorial crossroads. Now, she stood at the edge of the town's main street, a river of noise and sweat flowing past her. Cowboys swaggered from the batwing doors of a saloon, their laughter loud and cruel. Women in drab calico dresses hurried past, their eyes averted, as if looking at her might invite some contamination. The summer sun was a hammer, beating down on the raw timber of the storefronts and the tired horses hitched to the railings. Her father's letter, tucked into her sleeve, contained a crudely drawn map. It led her away from the boisterous center of town, toward a small, neat cabin set back against a rise of ochre-colored hills. A corral stood beside it, holding a single, powerful-looking buckskin horse that watched her approach with intelligent eyes. A man was on the porch, his back to her. He was not polishing a pistol or cleaning a rifle, as she had imagined. He was mending a piece of tack, his hands moving with a slow, deliberate economy. My Lin stopped at the foot of the porch steps, her shadow stretching long and thin in the afternoon light. The chest on her back felt heavier than a mountain. She waited. The man did not turn. The silence was broken only by the buzz of flies and the creak of a distant wagon. Finally, she cleared her throat, a small, dry sound. The man stopped his work. He set the leather strap down with care before turning. He was tall and lean, his face weathered by sun and something deeper, a kind of exhaustion that had settled into the lines around his eyes. They were grey and steady, and they took in everything at once, the heavy chest, the carefully wrapped gifts, the travel dust staining her simple dark trousers and tunic, and the resignation on her face. This was Arthur Vance, the gunslinger her father had sent her to. She bowed her head slightly. "I am My Lin," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "My father, Wei, sent me." Arthur's face remained unreadable. He looked from her to the dusty road she had walked, then back to the heavy chest on her back. A flicker of something, not anger, but a deep and profound weariness, passed through his eyes. He did not invite her to set down her burden. He did not offer her water. He finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "I didn't ask for this." Therefore, My Lin stood where she was, the straps of the chest biting deeper into her flesh. She had expected cruelty, or perhaps a greedy appraisal. This flat, empty rejection was something else entirely. It was an impassable wall. But she could not turn back. There was nothing to turn back to. "My father said a debt was owed," she stated, not as a plea, but as a fact. "Your father and I have a different understanding of debt," Arthur said. He finally gestured, not to the porch, but to the chest. "You can put that down." The relief was so immense that she nearly stumbled as she shrugged the weight from her shoulders. The camphor wood chest landed on the dusty ground with a solid thud. She remained standing, her hands clasped before her, holding the 2 gifts. Arthur watched her, his expression unchanged. He was a man encased in stillness. "There's a room at the back," he said, turning away from her and picking up his piece of tack again. "The well is out yonder. Don't expect anything more." It was not a welcome, but it was not a refusal. For now, it had to be enough. My Lin picked up her chest, her arms straining with the effort, and carried it into the shade of the porch. The cabin door was open. Inside, it was sparse but clean. A simple cot, a stone fireplace, a table with 2 chairs. It was the home of a man who owned little and wanted less. She found the back room. It was hardly more than a closet, with a narrow bed and a small window looking out at the hills. She set her chest down and, for the first time in 3 weeks, allowed her shoulders to slump. She had arrived. The real trial, she knew, was just beginning. The days that followed were measured in silence. Arthur Vance was a ghost in his own home. He rose before dawn and was gone, tending to his horse or riding out into the territory. He returned after dusk, ate the simple meal of rice and dried vegetables she prepared, and then sat on the porch, watching the stars come out. He never spoke of her father. He never asked what was in her packages, which she had placed carefully on the small mantel. He never asked her name again. My Lynn, in turn, created her own silent routine. She cleaned the small cabin until the floorboards shone. She tended a small, struggling garden patch behind the house, coaxing stubborn shoots from the dry soil. She walked into town once a week for supplies, enduring the stares and whispers of the townsfolk. They saw her as the gunslinger's property, a curious trinket he'd acquired. They did not see the sharp, calculating mind behind her quiet eyes, the way she noted the inflated price of flour at the general store, the poor quality of the seed, the way one man seemed to own or have a hand in every transaction. His name was Sterling, and he ran the saloon, the freight office, and, it seemed, the entire town of Redemption Gulch. One afternoon, as she was leaving the mercantile, a man stepped into her path. He was large and smelled of stale beer and sweat. He wore a holster on his hip, but the pistol looked more for show than for use. She recognized him as one of Sterling's men, a lounger from the saloon. Well now, he sneered, his eyes roaming over her. Vance's little shadow. What did you buy, girl? My Lynn held her basket of goods tighter and tried to step around him. He blocked her again. I asked you a question, he said, his voice growing louder, drawing the attention of passers-by. He reached for her basket. Sterling likes to know what new things come into his town. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a calm mask. She held her ground. These are provisions. For Mr. Vance's home, she said, her voice even. The man laughed. Mr. Vance, he mocked. He ain't no mister. He's a killer. And you're his property. Which means you're Sterling's property, too, in a way. He lunged for the basket. But before his fingers could touch it, a hand clamped down on his wrist. It was Arthur. He had moved with no sound, appearing from the alley beside the mercantile like a wisp of smoke. His grip on the man's wrist was not violent, but it was absolute. Let her go, Brant, Arthur said, his voice dangerously low. Brant tried to pull away, but Arthur's grip was like iron. A look of fear replaced the man's drunken bravado. Just having a bit of fun, Vance. No harm meant. You're bothering the lady, Arthur said, his eyes as cold and grey as river stones. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. The quiet menace in his tone was more chilling than any shout. He tightened his grip, and Brant winced, his face paling. And you're drawing attention. Mr. Sterling doesn't like attention. At the mention of Sterling's name, Brant seemed to shrink. Arthur released him with a slight shove. The man stumbled back, rubbing his wrist and glaring at My Lynn with pure hatred before scurrying away toward the saloon. The small crowd that had gathered quickly dispersed, unwilling to be witnesses. Arthur looked at My Lynn. He glanced at her basket, then at her face. He had not defended his property. He had said, "You're bothering the lady." It was the first time he had acknowledged her as a person. He gave a slight nod. "Go on home," he said, and then he turned and walked away, melting back into the shadows from which he came. That evening, the silence in the cabin was different. It was no longer empty, but filled with an unspoken tension. He sat at the table while she served the meal. For the first time, he watched her as she moved. After they ate, he gestured to the 2 packages on the mantel. "What's in them?" he asked. The question she had been waiting for. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she rose, took the packages, and brought them to the table. The light from the single oil lamp cast a warm glow on the polished wood. With delicate fingers, she untied the silk cord from the first box. She opened the lid, and the air filled with the rich, fragrant scent of oolong tea leaves from a province thousands of miles away. "My mother's family were tea merchants," she said softly. "This is all I have left of them." Arthur looked at the dark, twisted leaves, his expression unreadable. He gave a slow nod, a gesture of respect for the offering. Then, she turned to the second, heavier package. It was wrapped in oilcloth. She unfolded it carefully, revealing not silks or porcelain, but two thick, leather-bound ledgers and a dark, wooden abacus, its beads worn smooth with use. Arthur stared at the objects, a deep furrow forming between his brows. "What is this?" "This," Mai Lin said, her voice gaining a strength he had never heard before, "is why my father called me stupid." She opened the first ledger. The pages were filled with columns of elegant, precise characters, a language of numbers and symbols he could not read. "My father is a gambler. A dreamer. He bought a freight business with my mother's money. He would have lost it within a year." She moved a bead on the abacus with a flick of her finger. The click was sharp and decisive in the quiet room. "I ran his books for 6 years. I negotiated with suppliers. I tracked every ounce of cargo, every penny of profit and loss. He never understood the numbers. He only understood the drink and the cards. He called my work a woman's foolishness." She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. "He lost his business to Mr. Sterling a month ago. In a card game." Arthur's jaw tightened. "I heard something of it." "He did not lose," Mai Lin said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He was cheated." "I know he was." She pushed the second ledger across the table. It was newer, its pages less worn. "This is a copy I made of Sterling's freight office records. I paid a boy to bring me the pages late at night. Sterling is charging the miners double the rate for shipping and supplies, but recording the old rates in the books he sends to the territorial office in Prescott. He is stealing from the miners, and he is cheating the government." Arthur stared at the ledger, then at her. The quiet, timid woman he had tolerated in his house was gone. In her place was someone with a mind like a steel trap and a core of unyielding resolve. He finally understood. Her father had not sent him a housekeeper. He had sent him a weapon, just one that didn't fire bullets. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice rough. "Because Mr. Sterling is the reason you are trapped here," she said simply. "I have watched. I have listened. He pays you, not in cash, but by keeping quiet about something in your past. He uses your reputation like a guard dog to keep honest men away while he bleeds this town dry. But a man like Sterling, a man who builds his house with stolen bricks, always leaves a crack in the foundation." She tapped the ledger. "This is the crack." A long silence stretched between them. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant, as if looking back over the years of his life. The gunslinger, the killer, the man feared in 3 territories. All of it a cage built by another man's greed. "My younger brother," he said at last, his voice so low she had to lean forward to hear. "He was wild. Rode with a bad crowd. They robbed a bank warrant. He was shot, and I was there. They said I was with them. Sterling was on the posse. He knew I wasn't part of it, but he was the only one who could clear my name. He never did. He holds that warrant over me. If I leave, he sends a telegraph to the U.S. Marshal. So that was the truth of it. They were both prisoners in this town, bound by the same man. The telegraph runs both ways," Mai Lin said. "A warrant is one man's word. But numbers do not lie. A federal agent would be very interested in mail fraud." He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw not a plain face or a foreign woman, but a fierce intelligence and a courage that shamed his own weary resignation. He had been fighting his cage with silence and distance. She was offering him a key. What he found in her eyes was not a plea for rescue, but a proposal of alliance. The next morning, before the sun had risen, a hard knock came at the door. Arthur opened it to find the town's part-time marshal, a paunchy man named Davies who did whatever Sterling told him to. Standing behind him, a smug look on his face, was Sterling himself. "Vance," Davies said, avoiding Arthur's eyes. "Got an official notice here. An eviction. Sterling has filed a new deed on this property. Says your claim is invalid. You've got 24 hours to vacate." Sterling smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "Just business, Vance. I'm expanding my interests. I'm sure a man of your talents can find lodging elsewhere. Perhaps much, much farther away." It was a clear threat. He was calling Arthur's bluff. Arthur's hand instinctively moved toward the pistol on his hip. It was the old response, the one the world expected of him. But he stopped. He looked past Sterling, his eyes finding Mai Lin, who stood in the doorway behind him. Her face was calm, her expression resolute. She gave him the slightest of nods. He was not just Arthur Vance, the gunslinger, anymore. He was a man with an ally. He let his hand drop. "You'll have your response within 24 hours, Marshal," Arthur said, his voice level. He closed the door in Sterling's surprised face. He turned to Mai Lin. The cabin felt small, the walls closing in. The path of violence was easy, familiar. But it would lead to a noose or a shallow grave. She was offering another way, a path he had forgotten existed. "The telegraph office," she said. "We need to send a message to the territorial capital. Not to the law here. To the federal auditors." It was a gamble. A desperate, long shot of a play. But looking at the quiet confidence in her eyes, Arthur felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a decade: hope. 6 months later, the autumn air in Redemption Gulch had a crisp, clean edge to it. The dust seemed to have settled. A federal investigation, prompted by a detailed and irrefutable telegraph message from an A. Vance, had descended upon the town. Sterling's empire, built on fraudulent books and intimidation, had crumbled like a rotten log. His ledgers, when cross-referenced with the meticulous copies Mai Lin had provided, told a story of systemic theft that the federal agents could not ignore. Sterling was gone, taken to Prescott in irons to await trial. The cabin at the edge of town had changed. A new room had been added, built with fresh-cut timber. The corral held 2 horses now, and the small garden patch had expanded, its bounty of squash and beans carefully preserved for the winter. The eviction notice was a distant memory, replaced by a legal, ironclad deed in the names of Arthur and Mai Vance. They had been married by a traveling circuit judge 2 months prior, a simple ceremony on the porch with no one but the setting sun as a witness. Their partnership had become the quiet talk of the town. Arthur, no longer living under the shadow of Sterling's threat, had put away his gun belt. He worked his small but growing plot of land, his hands now calloused from fence posts and soil, not from the cold steel of a pistol. He was still a quiet man, but the exhaustion in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, steady calm. Mai Lin had become an unlikely pillar of the community. With Sterling's monopoly broken, she helped the local ranchers and miners form a cooperative, using her abacus and her sharp mind to ensure they received fair prices for their goods and paid fair rates for their freight. They had initially been wary of the gunslinger's Chinese wife, but her honesty and undeniable skill had won their respect. They no longer saw a foreigner, they saw the woman who had freed them. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the hills, Arthur was mending a fence post at the edge of their property. Mai Lin came out from the cabin, carrying 2 porcelain cups. She handed one to him. It was the oolong tea, its fragrant steam rising in the cool air. He took the cup, his large, rough hands gentle around its delicate rim. He looked at her, at the woman his world had dismissed as plain and stupid, the woman sent as payment for a debt. She had not been the settlement of an old obligation. She had been the beginning of a new life. His father-in-law had made a mistake, Arthur thought. He had cast away his greatest treasure, believing it to be a worthless stone. His mistake had been Arthur's salvation. "Thank you," he said, the words encompassing everything, the tea, the home, the quiet peace she had brought into his life. Mylin smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips. "It is good land," she said, looking out at the hills. "It is a good home." They stood together in the fading light, a partnership forged not in passion or romance, but in mutual respect and quiet courage. It was a foundation far stronger than any built on fear or obligation, a life earned one honest number at a time. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.